We're live.
Are we live?
We are live.
Yes, look at that. It's 3 live. Well, as everyone's computers are zooming into the thing, oh, and there's people joining the call. It looks like we're
Oh,
the real
yeah.
thing. I should turn off the part where it actually talks back to me so I don't have to hear that. Um, People have joined. Look at that. There's friendly names inside here, people that we know. Um, Welcome to our live event. I'm Phil Yanov, host of Conversations with Modern Stoicism. Today I'm talking with Donald Robertson, the author, cognitive psychotherapist, and one of the people most responsible for bringing Stoic philosophy into serious conversation with modern psychotherapy. We're going to get into what Stoic psychotherapy actually is, how much of it was already hiding inside CBT, and what ancient texts still have to offer people in genuine distress. Donald, as always, I'm glad to be in conversation with you.
Well, it's nice to see you again, Phil. And may I say you're looking well. I'm very excited about speaking to you about ancient stuff once again. Um, ancient Greek philosophy, I like to think, is the future. So it seems like a
I
good
like
place to
it.
start.
I say that is a place to bend us right at the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it ancient is the
Or
future? I like it.
ancient Hellenistic philosophy is the new rock and roll.
All right.
Not going
Yes.
too
I mean,
far.
the thing is, in terms of people in distress, I think there's as many as there's ever been, right? There's more people on the planet and more of them seem to
Yeah.
have trouble with their lives. So let's talk about that. Can I drive you to that? I mean, when you say
Yeah.
the title says Stoic psychotherapy. When you
Yeah.
say Stoic psychotherapy, what are you actually describing? Has it always been there or is this
Well,
something new?
it's always been there. It was hiding. Um, so, well, let me start off by kind of dealing with the concept and the word. So, the word psychotherapy, as far as I know, doesn't exist in ancient Greek, but they talk about therapy of the psyche. So they come pretty close. I'm not sure that the compound psychotherapy would actually make sense in ancient Greek, but they basically say the same thing. They talk about therapy of the psyche. There were entire books written about it. It was a very familiar concept. They apply the medical model to it, which is, an integral part of it. People today think that psychotherapy originated with Sigmund Freud, often, but they're wrong. Freud trained in psychotherapy in Nancy, in France, the town of Nancy, and at the Salpêtrière Hospital under Charcot. And those guys did hypnosis and early psychotherapy, but the modern pioneer of psychotherapy, in my view, was obviously Scottish. He was a guy called James Braid. He was a physician. He wrote the first modern book on hypnotism in 1841, 42, or something like that. And so that's how modern psychotherapy originated. But the concept isn't new. Not everything is new. Not everything modern is new. We kind of fall into the trap of thinking that they had psychotherapy in the ancient world. They just conceptualized. They didn't sit in a consulting room, obviously. They didn't go on about it on what you call it, TikTok, like people do today. But they existed in the ancient world. They wrote a lot of books about it. Like they did it. They had people that functioned kind of like mentors. If you want to see how close it is, there are in the Socratic dialogues of Xenophon in the Memorabilia Socratis, you see Socrates doing things in several of those dialogues that really obviously look like a form of cognitive therapy. Actually, often a kind of relationships therapy. He talks to his own son about how he gets angry with his mother, Xanthippe. We've all heard about her. So his son Lamprocles,
Right.
memorably portrayed by Christopher Walken in the TV movie, a young
Yeah.
Christopher Walken. Go and look that up. When he looks like he's about 19 or something, and barefoot in Athens. So he talks to Lamprocles about how his mum's driving him crazy and she's like a pain in the neck. He's an adolescent, and Socrates does this kind of cognitive therapy with him, dealing with his anger and frustration. And then the brother of one of his best friends, his best friend's brother actually, a guy called Chirocrates. He does a kind of similar kind of process with him. One of the first things he asks people, Socrates, in these Socratic dialogues, is, do other people feel the same way? which is like a really basic therapy question
Mhm.
that we would ask today.
Sure.
Like, this is awful. My brother's a total jerk. I can't stand him. Does everybody feel the same way about your brother? Like, and so you see them going, well, some people don't, but they're idiots or whatever, and da da da. Like, so it opens up, begins to get them to think maybe there's other perspectives on this that are available. Like, it gets them to start thinking of like the way that they feel is being related to their thinking and their own perspective. Just that question is a pretty good starting point. And Socrates knows that, like, and he asks that question. And even in Plato's version of Socrates, we see a similar questions cropping up in Book One of the Republic, for example. So they didn't sit in consulting rooms and stuff, but they had people. So Marcus Aurelius, for example, in Book One of the Meditations, go look this up. Like in Book One, Section 7 or something, I think, he's talking about Junius Rusticus, who seems to be his main Stoic mentor. And
Right.
decades, he's looking back on his childhood, and he says one of the main things that Rusticus introduced me to is therapia. Like, so this guy was his mentor, his friend, his Stoic tutor. He wasn't a philosophy lecturer or professor. They hung out together, like, and discussed philosophy. And Rusticus did something that Marcus describes as therapia, like therapy of the psyche.
So with they didn't have the word. They clearly had the
They almost had
ideas.
the word.
Yeah, and well, yeah, they flipped them around, right? But there's lots of reasons this could happen to us later. Did but did they? Do you think that they thought this is what they were actually working on? That they were working on a therapy of the mind in
Yeah,
order to be able to get their way
yeah.
through a
I think.
difficult environment?
See, I kind of take this for granted, and so when I talk about it, people are like, seriously, and so sometimes I have to kind of back myself up a little bit and go, yeah, like, this is a thing that existed in the ancient world. So we have entire books, like texts that relate to this that survive today. Often it takes the form of self-help. You could say, in a way, this is what Marcus Aurelius is doing in the Meditations. Epictetus refers to what he's doing face to face with his students as therapia. Um, but most importantly, so we have an entire book by Seneca on anger, about Stoic psychotherapy for anger, basically, that survives today. Like cognitive behavioral therapists, when they read that, tend to go, this sounds surprisingly similar, like to the kind of things that we would say about anger today. But what we're missing, one of the reasons that people are confused about this, is that what we're missing is the original textbook or manual of Stoic therapy. Now, Chrysippus, who is like the Stoic equivalent of Aristotle, he was universally considered to be one of the greatest intellectuals of the ancient world. He was the third head of the Stoa, and most of Stoic philosophy, later authors thought, really was kind of revitalized and comes from Chrysippus. He took Zeno's ideas and really kind of developed them. He wrote 700 books or texts, none of which survive today. And one of them was a 4-volume work called Peripathon, which means on the passions.
Right.
The Greek word pathos means emotion, but it also means suffering or disease. And it's the root of our word pathology. So at a pinch, you could translate it as on psychopathology, because that's really what he's writing about. And the fourth and final volume of his book on psychopathology, on the emotions, was called To Therapeuticon, like the therapeutics. And in the ancient world, it was considered a kind of classic text on treatment, like on psychotherapy. He had a book about as we would say today, he had a book about the causes and the cures of neurosis. It was a 4-volume on psychopathology of the emotions, and the final volume was on treatment. And 400 years later, Galen, the court physician of Marcus Aurelius, is still citing it and talking about it. And then decades after that, like Origen, one of the church fathers, is still referencing it. So this book was well known, like as a foundational text on Stoic psychotherapy, for at least 400 years. But today, no one's heard of it. We've all forgotten about it. But Seneca, when he writes on anger, looks like he's drawing on it as well, you'd expect. Like, he seems to be drawing on this kind of foundational text on Stoic therapy. So how do we know what's in it, Phil?
That was exactly the question. Let me ask the question, and you answer it.
Yeah.
Donald, I think there are people out there. I think I've heard you say that there are people out there trying to pull fragments and
Yeah.
quotes and so forth, and trying to figure out what's in it. Where are we on that?
Welcome to the world. Welcome to the world of classics.
Yeah.
Like, where 99% of the texts no longer exist. But we have testimonia, like we have fragments, we have often, and annoyingly, often by people that don't agree, like with what the original text say, that are disputing it. And so it might be
Let
kind
me
of,
just say, my own track on in life, right, is things that I don't like, I'm more likely to write
yeah,
about because I'm
to
gonna
write about.
complain, right? So,
Oh,
yeah.
right. So there's a scholar called Thielemann, in about 20 years ago, like wrote an entire book on Chrysippus's Peripathon, where he tries to reconstruct what he thinks it probably says, looking at passages from Galen and Posidonius and other. Cicero's Tusculan Disputations seems to be drawing on it pretty heavily. So modern scholars have, with kind of in meticulous detail, tried to do this detective work of reconstructing from the fragments. And there's certain things that seem pretty likely. There's chunks of it that are quoted. There's inferences we can make. So we've got a rough idea what it probably said. And then we can see, yeah, it kind of lines up with the sort of things that Seneca and Marcus Aurelius are going on about as well. By 400 years later, like they've probably developed the concept of Stoic psychotherapy and made it more elaborate. I'm guessing what Chrysippus said was a bit more schematic, a bit more basic. But yeah,
Mm.
like, and what kind of book on psychotherapy was it? Well, long story short, right, the first thing we're going to say is it is a book on cognitive behavioral psychotherapy. Basic, clearly, like the central premise of it in the ancient world was well known to be the idea that our emotions are a form of cognition. Like, so thought and emotion overlap. Um, this is clearly a theme in Stoicism, and it's well known to be one of the central premise of Chrysippus's book. So this is arguably the first ever major text on psychotherapy, and it's kind of weird news for cognitive behavioral therapists because they think what they're doing is kind of modern, and psychoanalytic therapy came first. But actually, cognitive behavioral therapy was the
Mm.
original form of psychotherapy in this sense. So in the 1950s, Albert Ellis, who was a psychoanalytic therapist in New York, got fed up with it, started again from scratch, got rid of all his books on psychoanalysis, and he'd read Marcus Aurelius and he'd read Epictetus. And so Ellis developed this thing called rational emotive behavior therapy, which became the original form of CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. And he quoted Epictetus in every book he wrote to all of his students, to all of his clients. It's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. That's a simple expression of the cognitive model of emotion. And that became a
Right.
cliche in CBT. So all of modern CBT ultimately was inspired by this. Tim Beck, like the founder of cognitive therapy, R&T Beck, he also said, he didn't quote Epictetus as much, but he said explicitly, Stoicism constitutes the philosophical origins, in his words, of cognitive behavioral therapy. But I want to give a shout out to another guy who no one ever mentions, unless it's a deep cut in the field of psychotherapy. Like, Ellis introduced Stoic inspired psychotherapy in the 50s, but in the early 1900s, his first book, I think, was 1904 on the subject. There was a guy who was famous at the time called Paul Dubois. He was a Swiss psychiatrist and neurologist, and he founded a method called rational psychotherapy. And Dubois was really into Seneca, and he would prescribe Seneca's moral letters as homework, like to be read by his patients between sessions. And he quotes Seneca repeatedly. He clearly is drawing on Stoicism in his model of psychotherapy. and he was a rival of Freud for a long time. And I'll give you another bit of obscure. I know you like your obscure trivia,
I
right?
do.
I've got a lot of obscure trivia about the history of psychotherapy. In the Soviet Union, they couldn't give two hoots about Freudian psychoanalysis. Like, they thought it was pseudoscientific mumbo jumbo. Like, and so Freud took over, particularly in America and around Western Europe. But in the Soviet Union, they thought it was mumbo jumbo. And Bekhterev, who supposedly was psychotherapist to Stalin subsequently, like, so, but people believe that he had a meeting with Stalin, and Stalin said, "I want you to do a diagnosis of me." And according to legend, Bekhterev was never seen again. Like, I don't know if that's, I've heard that that story is not entirely authoritative, but
Yeah.
the apocryphal story. Like, so Bekhterev had studied under Dubois, and he took Stoic inflected rational psychotherapy to the Soviet Union, where it became more established than it was in America. And so America had to wait half a century for cognitive therapy to be rediscovered, basically, and Stoicism to be rediscovered. But Dubois, like, had already done it. And Ellis said he hadn't read Dubois. But within a couple of years, people obviously pointed this out to him and brought it to his attention. And he went, fair play, this guy was an important precursor of my approach. That's a potted kind of modern history of the Stoic influence. Interestingly, Ellis virtually never mentions Seneca. He mainly mentions Epictetus and sometimes Marcus Aurelius. And Dubois is the opposite. He almost exclusively talks about Seneca, so they were drawing on different Stoics. Ellis is always quoting this thing. It's not events that upset us, but rather our opinions of them. Dubois focuses on another aspect of Stoicism. And it's the opening passage of the Enchiridion that says some things are under our control and other things are not, which you guys like to call the dichotomy of control. Right? I sometimes call it the Stoic fork, but that was what Dubois tended to focus on, that aspect of Stoicism. Although he also had this idea that, the same as Ellis, that it's our thinking, our beliefs. He would have said our fixed ideas that really explain our emotional problems. So he develops that and some other aspects of Stoicism that are relatively neglected in Ellis. You put those two things together, then Stoicism has quite a profound influence, really, more than is
Yeah.
normally assumed in the modern field of psychotherapy. But none of those guys, Phil, had ever heard, I think, as far as I know, of the Therapeuticon, like the lost masterpiece, like, and founding text of Stoic psychotherapy, because Telemann hadn't reconstructed it like until a couple of decades ago, basically. So they're unlikely to have really known anything about it. They're reading Marcus Aurelius and Seneca and Epictetus, who are really just taking it for granted. Like, so they're kind of getting the watered down, it's filtering down to them indirectly.
Yeah. So in this piece, well, there's so many threads I want to pull on. Let me just start with one. Could you imagine someone today telling people they should go read Seneca and look for patterns in there, look for ideas in there, a way they might improve their own thinking? I mean, I think that's a fabulous idea.
But I don't think many cognitive behavioral therapists do. It's weird. Like, they generally they haven't kind of jumped on the bandwagon, and I'm probably biased in this regard. But my
Yeah,
clients go on more about Stoicism to me than I do to them.
sure.
I think often, right? So that's because they read books on Stoicism, and that's partly why they know about me and they get in touch with me and stuff like that. So if you're asking about my own experience, they're all off reading like books on Stoicism left, right, and center.
Yeah,
And sometimes I'll suggest that they read individual. I don't usually tell them go off and read Seneca, like, but I might discuss Stoic concepts with them and get them
sure.
go away and do exercises that are based on it. Unless they really ask me about a specific thing where I think there's a very relevant text. But it's not a crazy idea. Like, a lot of clients that are in therapy will go and read this stuff for themselves. And it's like, I want to emphasize something about this that should, like, I think when I tell this to modern psychotherapists, at first they're confused and then they're slightly offended, and then they kind of think it through and it begins to make sense to them, right? The reason that people like Stoicism is because the surviving Stoics are better writers than any modern cognitive behavioral therapists. And you think, well, that's bad. Maybe some modern cognitive behavioral therapists are quite good writers. We have 1% of the ancient literature surviving, and the stuff that we have was curated in part because it was the best stuff. Like, it was the creme de la creme. Seneca is one of the most
Sure.
talented writers of antiquity. Cicero,
Right.
who's one of our main sources for Stoicism, is generally regarded as the greatest of Roman orators. Marcus Aurelius had studied rhetoric for decades under the leading Greek and Latin rhetoricians of his lifetime. So it's no coincidence that this stuff survives because it's written by people who were highly skilled, highly trained writers who dedicated their lives to perfecting their art, right? So it's like getting CBT that was written by Shakespeare in a way.
Oh, I thought and yeah, that is clearly Seneca, right? I mean, the sheer volume of it, it's in an
Yeah.
approachable Latin, it's exceedingly well written, and it's one of those things that I think as you go back through it, you continue to see nuance in his writing, right? When the first time you get it,
Oh,
you kinda see what he said, and then you sort of see what he meant, and then you kinda see what he was hiding behind all of that on successive reading. So I think there's a
it
lot.
rewards, yeah, repeated
It
study.
I think it does. Okay,
And
so
nobody, Phil, except you don't have a CBT tattoo. Nobody has a CBT tattoo. Like, but hands up in the audience if you've got a
yeah,
Marcus Aurelius tattoo or a Stoicism
amor
tattoo,
fati.
or something like that, Memento Mori, or a picture of Marcus Aurelius's head, or something like that.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of people out. There's enough of them that they could form a community, like out there with
Oh,
Stoicism tattoos, right?
you could have
And that
a club of just people with Stoic tattoos. Yeah.
That's because people identify with Stoicism and they identify with the sayings in a way that they don't really identify with modern CBT. And so, CBT practitioners should probably make more use of that, like, and jump on it and say it's part of our culture and our heritage, and it resonates with people at a different level and they remember the sayings of Marcus Aurelius. Epic. I mean, like most things, it's a mystery in broad daylight, right? Ellis spent his
Mm,
entire life churning out books, and yet he ended up just quoting Epictetus over and over again to all of his patients because he thought, I can't put it better than Epictetus put it. Basically, his saying, everyone remembers, people get it tattooed on them and stuff like that. Like, and Ellis was like, yeah, like this guy, and do you know why, Phil? Because Epictetus didn't write that stuff. Like, he
well,
may have said it. He may have said it, but it was written by Arian, and he
yeah,
was highly educated. He was commander of the like a small army, he was in charge, I think, of 3 legions under Hadrian.
yeah.
So he was a senior Roman. He's probably the top ranking Roman general of his
Listen,
lifetime. And he was a highly educated, highly literate man again.
yeah, quite talented, and he had a mission of his own. But I think all of us should be so fortunate as to have a man as educated and capable as Arian that stands around, takes notes on everything we say, and then tunes it up and puts it out in a book. So yeah, he was
Yeah.
that was pretty fortunate. Um, there's so many threads I want to pull on. Let me pull on this one first.
Uh-huh.
You, there is, you've already made the argument, right, that there is a long-standing tradition in philosophical stoicism for therapy, right?
Mhm.
What is it about stoic practice that actually moves the needle psychologically? Why does this work? What about it is
Oh.
it that is making it work?
Well, let's explain what it looks like. All right.
Yeah,
So we've provided a bit of the context. Some people might be thinking, what does it actually look like? What did Chrysippus actually say? And that answers your question. All right. So first thing I'm going to do is give people the answer that they don't want. Right. Which is everybody wants techniques from therapy. Like
right.
techniques, schmechniques, right? Like, the techniques don't work unless you understand the rationale for them, generally speaking, in many cases, right? So the conceptualization is important. And let me explain why that's the case. Because a lot of these techniques people use to deal with their emotions. What the hell is an emotion? We have what psychologists and philosophers call a folk psychology. right? So folk psychology is the term that we use to describe the naive or default psychology that everyone takes for granted in our society. It's baked into the language that we use and the culture that surrounds us. And for example, we have a folk psychology of emotions, right? The folk psychology of emotions that we have is wrong, right? It's very crude
Right.
and simplistic, right? So the problem is, you go on the internet and it's full of self-help authors, and they say, "Well, this is how you deal with anger. This is how you deal with anxiety." What is anger? Anxiety? What is anger? You don't even know what it looks like. Like, how would it make? How would you know how to cope with it? How are the techniques going to make sense if we don't start off with some kind of conceptualization of what the thing is that you're trying to work with, right? If you don't know what an emotion is, like you're going to go around in circles looking for ways of coping with it. So the answer that nobody wants is that you need to start off with conceptualization of emotions, and that's exactly what Chris Ipis did. Like, his book is based on this idea that we need to understand emotion differently from the way that the majority of people understand it. So there's a couple of things that let me just give you an overview, and so fasten your seatbelts, right? There's going to be a lot of twos in this. There's several dualities that he refers to. So one of them is that Chris Ipis uh, makes a kind of sharp distinction between two different modes of the mind. So there's our normal mode of functioning where we're pretty rational, and then there's when we're in the grip of a passion and we get really angry or anxious. One of the biggest obstacles that most people face in therapy is they fail to distinguish clearly enough between being in radically different brain states, so neurological, physiological states. A lot of people today would say, in kind of pop psychology terms, your fight or flight response is triggered, right? Neuroscientists would say your fear circuit has been triggered, your amygdala has been triggered, maybe, right? So your brain is in a different state, it's doing different stuff. So we need to, at the very least, distinguish between these different states. And in a sense, everyone knows this already, but time and time again, people, for example, when their amygdala is activated and their fear circuit's been triggered, will sit down for a couple of hours and try and figure out solutions to their problems, right? And that might be a bad idea. When people's rage circuit is triggered, and they're in the angry mode of functioning, they'll think, I should sit down and have a word with my wife around the kitchen table, right? And Chrysippus and the Stoics understand this basic distinction that we probably want to wait until we're no longer in that mode of functioning before we engage in certain activities.
Mm.
Epictetus calls this gaining respite from the passion. And I would call it postponement, right? It's used a lot in anger management and the treatment of depression and worry today. But this basic, simple concept of noticing when you're in a passion, as the Stoics would put it, or as we would say now, that you're in a different neurological state, your brain's gone into a different mode, like, and waiting until that has naturally abated before you do stuff in order to avoid the problems that are associated with bias and so on. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of some of the central aspects of Stoic psychotherapy. That's one. So the distinction
Right.
between, we might say, between different modes of the mind. And then the other one would be that when a passion occurs, you guys talk about anger, anxiety in our in our rubbish folk psychology that we have. But I was saying the other day, if you look closely at almost anything in life, you start to question whether it's a thing at all, or whether it might be better to describe it as a process. I mean, an apple's a thing, Phil. But if you think
Yeah.
about it really carefully, it used to be, like a little bud growing in a tree, and eventually it rots and decays, and all you're left with is seeds, and then another tree grows from it or whatever. Like an apple, if you think about it accurately, is a process that unfolds over time and at different stages, like it has a different form. Definitely human beings are processes. And I hate to break it to you guys, but anger, anxiety, and depression are processes that unfold over time, and they're multi-component. So at the very least, we go from having this kind of homogenous idea that anxiety is just like a feeling, like, or an energy that somehow wells up within you. It's like a thing within you, to thinking, oh, it's it's like more like a recipe. Like it's a mixture of thoughts, actions, feelings, urges, and they kind of ebb and flow and they evolve and they have different phases, and they interact with other states. Like that would be a more realistic way of thinking about emotions. And as soon as you start thinking at that more realistic, nuanced level, you gain a lot more control. And Chrysippus wasn't playing. He laid out from the beginning a more complex, phasic, multi-component understanding of emotions. He wasn't mucking about. He wasn't talking about anxiety or anger as if it's just some kind of blob. He thought, no, we need to understand what's actually going on here. So one of the most important distinctions, he says, is look, for practical purposes, an easy distinction we can make is between at least two phases of emotion. So the triggering phase, the process of development that follows. So Chrysippus says there's an initial automatic phase, which the Stoics call the propatheia, or proto-passion, or Seneca refers to it as the first movement. And today we would say that's the automatic phase of processing, or the emotion being triggered, basically. And even there's a lot that we could say about it. It's a complex thing. But what happens is there's some kind of impression. I see or hear or feel something that's like a trigger. My brain has probably already appraised it as a threat. And then I have an initial reaction, the rage circuit, the fear circuit's triggered. I starts to get me in the feels, right? And the Stoics believe that if I then go along with that and allow myself to treat that initial impression as if it's reality, at that point, the second phase, we transition into the second phase and it becomes a fully fledged emotion. And the most important aspect of this is they go, well, what's the bridge between the first phase and the second phase? And the Stoics call that bridge synkatathesis, which is usually translated as assent to the impression. But I think that's a pretty lame translation. And I'm absolutely certain it's not what the Stoics mean. Because the way they use the word makes it pretty clear to me that what they're talking about isn't just going, oh yeah, that impression looks like I should agree with it. Looks like I go along with that. I can assent to that impression. No, what they mean is that you see somebody and they look like they're out to get you, right? Or you see something and it looks dangerous, right? That's your initial impression of it. And you go from thinking, I have the impression that that guy's hostile, or I have the impression that this could be dangerous, to thinking, that guy is hostile. This is dangerous, right? It's the is, it's
Right.
what psychologists today call fusion, right? So the impression becomes fused and identified with reality. Synkatathesis, I think, is stronger than assent. It does mean agreeing with it, but it also means treating it as reality. Nobody who's angry thinks I am assenting to the impression that that guy's a jerk right now. That would require a level of self-awareness that enraged people notably lack, right?
Right.
If I'm enraged, I don't think, right now I'm assenting to the impression that that guy's a jerk. I think, no, that guy is a jerk and he does deserve to have a punch in the nose. It's a fact, buddy.
Right.
That becomes my world, right? My world is transformed when I get anxious, afraid, enraged, and depressed. And the Stoics understood that. It goes from being an impression to being co-opted into my lived experience, as if it's objectively true, right? That becomes real for me now. And now it's a bit late to kind of back out of that, right? I'm captured by the impression. I'm living inside the impression, in a sense. So the Stoics think the key thing here is this kind of withholding of assent. Now, I just want to mention one other part of the Stoic analysis, right? And then we'll be done with the conceptualization. But I want to show people how sophisticated the Stoic model was, right? So I said the Stoics had a cognitive model. Chrysippus, we believe, there's a lot more I could say about this, but I'll give the kind of abbreviated version. Chrysippus is believed to have said that had to have a dual factor cognitive appraisal model of emotion, right? So he not only did he make those distinctions between two different modes of the mind, between two phases of the emotion, but he also made the distinction between two appraisals or impressions, if you like two judgments that constitute emotions. And the first one is evaluative, and it's the obvious one. It's everyone's favorite, right? So it's the obvious one. The first one says, "This sucks. This guy's a jerk. This is awful. This is a
Right.
disaster. Oh, this is awesome. I need to have it." Like, so the Stoics are equally interested in positive in desires and cravings and stuff. But in modern therapy, we tend to focus more on anxiety and anger and stuff like that. So the Stoics would say it's an evaluative judgment first. It says, like, this is awful, it's terrible, or something like that. But then there's a second judgment, according to Chrysippus, about what it's appropriate to do. And again, I think I question that translation. Like, I think the language the Stoics use is a bit stronger than that, and it's a judgment of what might be appropriate or necessary to do, which should remind people who are familiar with cognitive therapy of what Albert Ellis says. So Ellis said the irrational beliefs that are at the core of our problems often involve awfulizing, which would be the first evaluative belief that Stoics talk about. But even more important, he thought, were rigid demands, like about what has to be the case or what I have to do. And so the Stoics were particularly interested in rigid demands about our own behavior, moralizing beliefs. Um, they call them judgments of what I'm morally obliged to do, or what it's appropriate to do, what it's fitting to do, or what it's necessary to do. They also say they're excessive judgments, right? It's like, so really, to me, that's a kind of rigid imperative, it sounds like they're describing, especially when you look at their examples, right? So if somebody who's angry, like, thinks this guy's behavior is awful, it's unjust, it's terrible, what this person has done is awful, and I should get revenge against them. I should retaliate. I should get my own back. Like, they deserve to be punished, right? So anger's a clear example where there's this kind of two phases. Now, bit of trivia, this description clearly resembles one of the best known modern research-based models of stress and emotion. It was developed in the 1960s by a guy called Richard Lazarus. It's called the transactional model of stress. It's also a general model of emotion. And it's very well known today, very, very influential. And Lazarus, based on research on emotions, said there's a primary appraisal of threat and then a secondary appraisal of coping, or how it's appropriate to behave and what we're capable of doing in response. And stress and
Right.
anxiety result from the combination of those two things, and those two things in combinations define the type of emotion that we experience. So, for instance, if I think this is awful and it's necessary and appropriate for me to do is bolt out the room and get as far away as possible, I'm probably experiencing fear. Whereas if I think this is awful and what it's necessary for me to do is to run over there and punch that guy in the nose, I'm probably experiencing anger, right?
Yeah.
So the Stoics have, as we can see, this kind of phasic, multi-component cognitive model. So I'll just pause at this point because it's a lot, Phil, right? It's a
Yeah.
lot, and that's the tip of the iceberg. But how more sophisticated is that, right? This was 2,250 years ago, Phil.
Right.
Like, and so people today are like, whoa, I just thought anger was like this kind of blob of, like, energy that kind of popped into my mind sometimes. And the Stoics are like,
Yeah, it's like
no.
magic. Yeah, we always have these sort of mystical genie ideas about what's going on inside of there, and
So
it
do you
feels like
believe me now?
that they thought about
About
this. Yes.
no,
Well, the
do
thing
you
is,
believe me now that people may be wasting their time when they're trying to do self help if they don't have any kind of conceptualization of how their emotions function, right? Having some understanding of what an emotion looks like, different
so,
phases,
but give me
like,
let me give you a synthesis of this, right? So, this is kind of the example. The idea is if you don't know what's going on behind the buttons, pressing the
yeah,
button doesn't make any sense at all, right? And by the way, the common example, at least in the US, is that the closed door button on most elevators does nothing at all. 75% of elevators is not even connected. So, it's that kind of thing, right? If I don't understand what's happening inside of my head, if I don't have
Yeah.
even at the level of the Stoics, which is
Yes.
pretty sophisticated, a Stoic understanding of this, I'm
They're not
probably
playing.
going to get this wrong.
They're not playing Phil. Like that Chrysippus guy. Like he was serious about writing a book on therapy. Right. He's light years ahead of most modern
He's
self
light
improvement.
years ahead and hundreds of years ahead of Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius and
If you want
Seneca.
to know how crazy this is, right? I don't say lightly these guys were ahead of their time, right? But I really, really mean it. Like Ellis, like, didn't develop cognitive therapy until the 1950s. Like, we'd already had 100 years of psychotherapy before that.
Right.
Jung, Adler, Freud, like, they had
Yeah.
complex ideas, but Chrysippus is ahead of them in many
Yeah.
regards in terms of his understanding of emotion. Like, what he
Yeah.
says is more consistent than what they said with modern, like, research on the cognitive psychology of emotion. So
It's
it's
millennia
it's
ahead. Yeah.
it's crazy. Like, but I wanted to say,
But
like a good example. Let me give you an example of where this can go wrong, right? So, in dealing with anger, the advice that you'll get, I'll give you an example. I'll pick on somebody like that Andrew Tate guy, famous psychotherapist Andrew Tate. I don't know if you've heard of. He has a video about
nice.
Marcus Aurelius, right? And in which he mentions Bugatti sports cars, weirdly. Like, but he's talking about Marcus Aurelius. I don't think he's ever read Marcus Aurelius, right? But apparently, Andrew Tate thinks he's an expert on Stoicism, right? It's about how he was influenced by it and stuff. And he says, when you're angry, what you should do is go to the gym and pump things, right? And channel your anger into activity, right? You use it for something useful. Like, so if you ask a girl out on a date and she rejects you, it's natural that you should be irate about it if you're an adolescent boy, and you should go to the gym and pump things. Like, and then you could be like a real man, like Andrew Tate or whatever, right? Now, this is based on what we call the hydraulic folk psychology of emotion. The idea that anger is like an energy that wells up inside you and you can use it for stuff. If this would make no sense nowhere do any of the Stoics ever describe anything that looks like this, because it doesn't make any sense to them, right? If anger is to a large extent a product of our appraisals of threat and coping ability and stuff like that, going to the gym, all it does is burn off some of the adrenaline. Like, it does nothing, nada, to change the sense of entitlement, like the other underlying attitudes that made you get angry in the first place, right? And in fact, what it potentially does is just distract your attention from them. And where Socrates might say, does everybody feel a sense of enraged entitlement when they ask a girl out on a date and she says no? That's all, right? And then the adolescent fans of Andrew Tate would maybe go, well, I guess not everybody feels equally enraged by it. And then Socrates would say, do you think that might have something to do with your beliefs and values? Like, and could those possibly change and become more aligned with the beliefs and values of people that you admire because they cope well with setbacks and stuff like that? None of these books do they say go down the gym and pump things, right? Or like vent your anger and try and kind of purge it and get it out of your system. Research on anger consistently shows that venting or catharsis is possibly the least effective therapy technique ever invented, right? It doesn't work. And often it just makes people more prone to anger in the future, as well as causing interpersonal problems, right? But it's based on this idea that it's just a blob of energy that wells up inside you and you could kind of purge it out your system, like sticking your fingers down your throat and making yourself throw something up. Like, if you just kind of spill your guts and get your anger out, it gets out of your system. This is what happens if you have a kind of overly simplistic understanding of emotion. The self-help advice that you get ends up being nonsensical. Like, whereas to Chrysippus and the Stoics, researchers on emotion, this is obviously weird advice. Like, it doesn't make sense. So the Stoics never recommend doing this kind of stuff. So those are some of the things that they would do. I would say, let me just make brief practical distinctions. People say, well, what did the Stoics actually do, right? I normally divide this into 3 stages of therapy. So the Stoics, number one, are going to advise you to respond differently to your emotions being triggered. Like, they're going to advise you to try and stop the transition from the automatic phase to the voluntary phase of the emotion, like to catch it early. And they're going to do that by withholding assent and some other kind of like strategic moves. So also the Stoics practiced a form of mindfulness that they call prosoche, but they were very precise about what we're being mindful of and what form it takes. They had a lot of precision in this regard. So first of all, they're going to teach what you call reactive coping. Like, when the emotion is triggered, you're going to do something differently, right? There's a couple of things. Best advice you give yourself at that point, actually, is to slow down and pay attention. We find that today. Epictetus says that repeatedly. He actually says, talk to the impression and say, wait a moment. Like,
You're
the
just an
Stoics say,
impression.
don't
Yeah, you're
rush
just
into
yeah.
judgment. You're just an impression, and not entirely the thing that you claim to represent. Like, so that's diffusion. He's saying this is just an impression. I have the impression that this guy's a jerk and he deserves to be punched in the face, but slow down a minute. Like, that's just the impression that I have right now. Like, that doesn't mean to say that that's necessarily the only way of looking at things. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's reality. So the first thing is changing what happens in that situation. Number two, between episodes would be to practice premeditatio malorum. Like, we know that seems to have been integral to the original method of therapy in Chrysippus. People say, well, how am I going to be ready? What in that situation, like, I struggle to withhold assent. So obviously the Stoics very logically thought, well, practice it then. Like, in advance, like when you're sitting with your favorite comfy slippers on, you're sipping your warm mug of cocoa in your bedroom, you've got nothing, there's not much on TV, TV's rubbish, right? Sit back and prepare in advance for adversity. Imagine somebody acting like a jerk, like, and rehearse withholding assent, examining your impression, so that when it actually happens, like, it'll be easier for you to exercise those cognitive skills because you practiced it in advance. So they think, number two, practice in advance using premeditatio malorum, or what they call proendemein. Like, that's the Greek word that they actually used. And then number three would be Socratic questioning and changing what we would today we would call the cognitive structures or schemas. So then the Stoics have this concept. The Stoics make a distinction between our underlying beliefs and the appraisals that we make in the heat of the moment, right? So I might generally think that people that don't send me Christmas cards are jerks. That's kind of almost like a principle that I have. Like, it's almost like a philosophy.
I could demand people send me Christmas cards.
And then some individual doesn't send me a Christmas card, and I think, well, I generally believe that people that don't send me Christmas cards are jerks. This guy hasn't sent me a Christmas card, therefore this guy is a jerk. It's almost like this form of syllogistic reasoning, right? So
Yeah.
then I have the impression that this guy's a jerk, right? But it's based on these underlying general beliefs or schemas. So the Stoics think between episodes, I should be attacking those, like challenging them, questioning them, basically using the Socratic method. And that's a big part of what you see going on in the meditations and in the seminars of Epictetus with his students.
Right.
Is challenging these general assumptions, these general principles, training people in methods of disputation. Like, so that's the much more explicitly cognitive part. And then the premeditatio or proende main is a little bit more of like what we view as a sort of behavioral, like somewhere in between, more kind of behavioral, more skills based approach. Withholding assent again is more like a kind of skills based thing, but your classic Socratic questioning thing is going to happen in between. Those are some of the main things. Like that. That's the whole therapy in schematic form, basically.
Yeah. So, I mean, someone
More
trying
to it.
to grab this for themselves today, right? What the Stoics are saying, first one is slow down, right? Slow that whole process down in
Hold your
some way.
horses, buddy. Why, you
Yeah.
might be wrong. Like, you
Yeah.
could be maybe you're going a little bit too far.
I'm
Like,
gonna tell you, when I say this to myself or even to someone else and say, "I might be wrong," it shocks them. It's like, "I don't know. I'm making this claim, but I'm open to the idea that I'm wrong. Help me figure that out." I
you
think
don't
there is
even
real utility.
you don't even have to believe that you're wrong. Like, the Stoics want you to do
Mm,
something that's even more abstract and even simpler than that, which is kind of like just entertaining the possibility that there
right.
might be other ways of looking at it. That in order to
Yeah.
gain diffusion, like Epictetus says, you just have to say, you're just an impression, though. Like, you're
Yeah.
not identical. You could be an accurate impression, but you're still just an impression. Right? You're not identical. Like, I have the impression that this is awful and catastrophic. That's different from saying it actually is catastrophic. So they're just going, just rein that in a little bit. In order to freak out, I have to cross the line, like, into thinking, no, it actually is a disaster. In order to act dysfunctionally, to run out the room,
Right.
like, to lash out at someone, I have to cross that line into, uh, like, co-opting it into my perception of reality, taking it now as a premise for my action. Um, so yeah, just beginning. There's different ways. Like, little anecdote, right? Research on stress going back to the 1970s found that looking at children, adults coping with stressful tasks, like looking at their internal dialogue, there are typical differences between people that cope well with stress and people that cope badly with stress. And there's stereotypical things that people say that help them to cope well. And one of the most common ones is that they tell themselves to pause or slow down. Like, so if a kid's performing, try to do a jigsaw puzzle, and they're kind of getting stressed out about it, kids that cope badly with stress will, freak out, think I just can't handle this. I've got to get it right. Their internal dialogue will escalate things. Whereas kids that cope well with stress will say, hang on a minute, slow down, take your time, do the easy parts first. We tend to, it's very common. People say like things like, um, take your time, you can do this. So affirming their coping ability, their self efficacy, telling themselves to slow down, um, telling themselves to break the task down into steps. Like, we find all of these things going on in the Stoics because they're kind of intuitive in a way. But to withhold assent, they talk about fusing impressions with reality as giving assent hastily, right? And Epictetus says, tell the impression, wait a minute, slow down. So they're clearly referring to this idea of taking a pause, slowing down. Do you know Stephen Covey? He talks about this. Stephen Covey is the only self improvement author that I like. Like, pretty much, that's exaggeration. He's one of the few self
And
improvement
yeah.
authors that I think actually make sense. Like, Stephen Covey he says very, very simple things, but everything he says sounds like he's actually thought about it. I did a self help workshop. I used to run a self help bookshop. We did his book one week, and I thought the more I look at this book, at first I just thought it was kind of simplistic, and then I thought
Yeah.
it all hangs together. It's coherent. And then the next week, we reviewed a book by this guy called Deepak Chopra, and I thought it was the biggest load of mumbo jumbo I'd ever read in my life. It was incoherent. Like, whether or not I agreed with what he said, I thought it sounded like he was just quoting bits of things other people had said, contradicting himself. I was like, this guy hasn't thought through what he's saying. And the difference is night and day between
Mm,
the depth of coherence and understanding in this and Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, or whatever it's called. Right. But
yeah.
Covey says there's a gap between stimulus and response. And he got that. He says I think he couldn't remember where he got that quote from. It comes from a guy called Rollo May. He was an existential therapist, right? Rollo May goes
Right.
further and says that's the secret of mental health, like, is becoming aware of the gap between stimulus and response. That's what Stoics mean by the gap between the first and second phase of
Right.
emotion and the withholding of assent from impressions.
Yeah. And I mean,
It's the
just think
gap
about it.
that saves your bacon, Phil. It's the
Well,
little
the
gap
thing is,
that's going to
I,
save your bacon.
yeah, and the thing is, we're in a space, in a time, right, where everything around us wants us to do things quicker, make decisions quick. I mean, we're basically there's so much. we call it clickbait in social media, right? There's so many things that just want you to get an instant response. And in fact, the ability to simply slow that down just a little bit is such a powerful boost to your equanimity.
And so being more precise, what are the other ingredients here? Like slowing down, like if you're rushing things, it's hard to like regain control of your emotions and your perspective. Of course. Like what they're saying
Yeah,
is self-evidently true. But and we find this idea converging from many different we call it stop. It's similar to what we call stop and think strategy in CBT. Time and time again, people keep reinventing this same idea.
right.
But the other thing would be there's a shift to a kind of self-awareness. Prosoke, paying attention to your ruling faculty. There has to be like some type of deeper self-awareness at this point that explains withholding assent. And in part, the simplest version of it for the Stoics is realizing that the impression is an impression, like, and realizing, that in order to fuse it with reality, you have to go along with it. You have to respond to it in a certain way. It's something that you're doing, taking responsibility for it. So shifting to almost like we're now observing ourselves, right? The Stoics thought Galen has a book, by the way, Galen, where Galen disagreed with the
The doctor,
Stoics. Yeah. But 400 years
famously.
later or whatever,
Yeah,
he wrote a book called On the Diagnosis and Cure of the Soul's Passions, or this like the
right.
psyche's passions, psychopathology, right? Diagnosis and Cure of Psychopathology, you could say. Again, is a book in psychotherapy, right? And in it, he borrows from Chrysippus, like, and he's a big chunk of that book is him going on about how you need to find a mentor because, and kind of talking about how you would go about doing that and stuff. And it's partly because it's difficult to observe ourselves. And they thought if you have someone else, the way he explains it is he said there's one of Aesop's fables. Did you know that Aesop said that you have two sacks, Phil? Everybody has
Yeah,
two sacks. He said there's one that hangs in front of you, like there's a big sack and it hangs around your neck, and everywhere you go, it's right under your nose and you can't miss it. And he said that sack contains everybody else's flaws. And he said there's also a little tiny sack that hangs behind your neck, like in the blind spot of a camera, and you can never see it, but everybody else can see it. And that contains all of your own biases and flaws. And Galen quotes this, and he says that's why we need to find a mentor, like Junius Rusticus to Marcus Aurelius, right? Because often
yeah,
it helps to have somebody else's perspective. Now, there's ways that you can bridge that gap and do it for yourself, right? Um, it's harder. Like, I think the better point would be it's easier if you have somebody to help you, but it is possible to train yourself to become a self observer, like to gain that level of, as we could call it today, we'd call it metacognitive awareness, right? Or
yeah,
mindfulness. Like that level of self awareness, like, is slippery. It's evasive. Like, and something that will get in the way of it is an overly simplistic folk psychology, like thinking, "Oh, I'm anxious now, or angry now, or a bit depressed right now." That's self awareness that's like doesn't differentiate between anything that's going on. Like the more simplistic our view is, you can't just sit and observe yourself. Like if you don't have the concepts and the work, it would be felt like if you went bird
well,
spotting, right? You know when you go bird spotting and you're in the little hut and you've got your binoculars, right? But you don't know what you're
yeah,
looking at. Like I don't know what I'm looking at. What am I supposed to be looking for here, right? But if you've got a book that shows you what all the birds are and how to tell them apart and stuff like that, then you're on a roll and you can do some real bird watching. I presume. I wouldn't know. You might, right? But self awareness, mindfulness is like bird watching for the passions. You have to know
yeah.
what you're looking at. Like, otherwise, it's difficult to observe things carefully. Otherwise, it just kind of
Oh,
flies past.
yeah, absolutely requires training, and it's just a thing that you practice, and I feel like it's a thing that you completely get better at. All right, I want to go to number 2 on your list there, right? In Latin, we would say it was premeditatio malorum. I'm not sure what that word is that you're telling us in Greek. What was that again?
Proendimen.
Okay.
It means inhabiting in advance. And it's the word that
Okay.
Posidonius used when he was
Okay.
describing what Chrysippus taught. So we're not 100% sure, but it seems to have become the Stoic Greek term.
Yeah.
Like premeditatio malorum, what Seneca says, and Cicero uses that phrase,
Right.
means like premeditating bad things or adversity. But
Right.
the Greek word that they use to describe the same thing means something different. Like it means
Yeah.
inhabiting in advance. So having
Right. Well,
we're basically what we're doing is very simple. You're choosing to have the impression on purpose, voluntarily, and then allowing
yeah.
yourself to rehearse responding to it more wisely, basically.
Yeah, I like the Greek version of that, and for that very reason, right? It's just like putting ourselves forward and taking a look about what might happen. It doesn't necessarily have to be bad, but it could be the thing. So here's what I want to get at on that. So in Latin, premeditatio malorum, premeditation of adversity is the English version of that. In business settings, we'll call this doing a pre-mortem of something. We will look at a project or something like that and try to determine what could go wrong with that project, right? And just yesterday, I was suggesting this exercise to somebody,
Mhm.
and as they were talking to their clients, and they're going, "Yeah, they would never go for that." You and I know that some of the common complaints or reasons that people resist this idea is that either they're fearful of rumination or they actually get involved in rumination of this thing rather than using it as a training exercise. But there's real utility here. How do we get them past that hump?
I think one of the most useful questions people can ask themselves is what's the difference between the good version and the bad version of this concept or activity.
Sure. Yep.
I think that when I was a young guy and I studied philosophy, I often thought, rather than arguing whether democracy is a good thing or democracy is a bad thing, it might be more helpful to argue if there's a good version and a bad version of democracy. That tends to progress the argument a little bit more. So I think it's useful. This is a classic example of it. Is there a good version and a bad version of thinking about what could go wrong? Right. So the bad version is very familiar. We call that
Right.
worrying or anticipatory anxiety. Right.
Right.
Um, and then the good version is what we do a lot of the time in therapy and what the Stoics are recommending. So a lot of people say, well, if you think about bad stuff happening, isn't that just like worrying? Well, maybe there's different ways of doing it, but right? There's a good way and
Yeah.
a bad way. There's a difference. So what would the difference be? We can do a little bit of a deep dive into that for a minute because in some ways it's quite simple. Like, I mean, the short but slightly technical answer would be that for the Stoics, it would be defused, right? So if you're worrying, you're kind of thinking, my God, what if this happens? What if that happens? How am I going to cope? Right? It'd be awful. It'd be a disaster. I won't be able to handle it. It's unbearable. And then those beliefs are treated as if they're objectively true. Like when you're worrying pathologically about something. So your evaluations are fused with reality, right? You're captured by the enemy. You're captured by them. You're in the lobster trap of worry, right? It's too late. You're already fused like your faulty judgments with reality. Now you're just going round in circles. But during premeditatio malorum, it's defused, right? So you imagine losing your job or getting divorced or whatever happens to be, the stimulus, and then you have the gap before the response. Like, so you say, well, I think this would be catastrophic. I have the impression, that I wouldn't be able to cope with it. But then you say, but these are just impressions. This is just the shit I'm telling myself, right? It may or may not be true, but it's not an objective fact. It doesn't come from the world. It's not a physical property of the event. This is an evaluation that I'm imposing. It's something that I'm adding. Epictetus said, you know, if somebody's sent into exile, by all means say he has been sent into exile, but do not add the word alas. Like he said,
Right.
don't add the evaluation that it's catastrophic. At least be aware, that you're adding the evaluation. Be aware, that it's just one way of looking at things. There's other things, by the way. So worry, people lose track of time. There's more nervous arousal. There's usually more muscular tension. That's pretty indicative of worry. It tends to involve a lot more questions that are unanswerable because they're kind of vague and abstract. Worry tends to be conducted more at an abstract verbal level. Problem solving or and exposure therapy tend to be more concrete. Like sometimes they move back and forth, but they end up progressively being more concrete and visual, generally speaking. So there are multiple there are different processes, right? So there's a good version and a bad version about thinking about bad shit that could happen in the future. So again, people get very confused because they think, I don't see the difference. Like, but to many people, they go, there's clearly a difference between, like, for instance, problem solving and just worrying. Like, there's a difference between exposure therapy and worrying. A very simple way of putting it is in exposure therapy, operationally, what we normally do is pick one situation that a client can visualize, and then they sit with it for longer than normal and accept the uncomfortable feelings that it triggers, the proto passions, right? The automatic feelings that they have. Whereas in worrying, people tend to jump around, like, and they actually avoid contact with the trigger while, like, thinking about it in an abstract way. So it never. What worrying does is maintain anxiety at a moderate level indefinitely, whereas interestingly, it prevents anxiety from peaking, like, generally speaking, like, because it's kind of vague and it jumps around and stuff like that. But because it prevents anxiety from peaking, it prevents it from habituating as well. Like, so you end up just being trapped.
I think one of the things is sometimes we find ourselves sort of in love with the problem. We like so we worry this thing, right? So that we don't get rid of it.
Yeah, I think people become attached to their problems and start to kind of identify with them in a way. Um, but again, a big part of it, the most common treatment for worrying is postponement. Like, so not avoidance, but confronting the problem at a different time, at a time of your choosing. And so when you do that, you're not, like, in a state, like, you haven't got your fight or flight response triggered. So usually, I mean, to put it simply, when you're when you're anxious, you your amygdala is activated. It triggers the fear circuit. Your brain goes into a different mode of functioning, and so it seems to inhibit certain areas of your prefrontal cortex that make it harder for you. It makes it harder for you to empathize with people. It makes it harder for you to think about the wider and longer term consequences of your actions. So you're in that state of mind because you're in an emergency mode, right? Your brain is like, make a snap decision. Like, you've hit the emergency button, right? I need to think in black and white, extreme terms. Oh my God, what if the worst case happens? I won't be able to cope with it at all. We go to the kind of extreme when we're anxious. Whereas in problem solving, our thinking tends to be more nuanced. This is going to be difficult, but not impossible. This is bad, but not catastrophic, right? And we're more able to think about the wider context, the longer term implications. We're maybe more able to understand other people's perspectives. We're more able to generate alternative solutions and alternative ways of interpreting problems. All of that generally gets inhibited. And so we know that problem solving is impaired, decision making is impaired, mentalization or empathy is impaired when people are in a state of nervous arousal and their fear response has been activated. So Stoics say, why don't you just wait? Like, postpone thinking about it. Do you know how I would describe it, Phil? When you're washing your windows, and suppose I was to give you a bucket of dirty water and a dirty chamois leather, and you're washing your windows, and you're thinking, man, these windows aren't looking any cleaner. They're just kind of getting dirtier. Mate, I'll just need to keep scrubbing. Like, and you're at it for hours. And you think, if I just keep washing and washing and washing these windows, eventually they'll get clean. But you're making them dirtier rather than cleaner by scrubbing them with dirty water and dirty chamois leather, right? It doesn't matter how long you wash the windows, they're never going to get clean. Like, you're just going to keep moving dirt around. That's what worrying and rumination is like, because your brain is not in that state that I like to call, like, you're using the regions of your brain that are rubbish at problem solving, as I like to call them, right? To do problem solving. And so you'll generally just go round and round in circles because you're not really in a good state of mind. And even better if it's 3 o'clock in the morning and you've woken up in the middle of the night and you're anxious. So you're half asleep and anxious, right? So you're washing the window with dirty water. You're just going to go round. That's why it takes like hours. Like people go round and round and round and round. Whereas if you waited, sat down, put on your comfy slippers, had your warm mug of cocoa, put on the theme music to Gladiator, right? Dimmed the lights, right? Sat down, went, I'm going to give this like 15, 20 minutes and I'm going to give it my full attention and think about this problem. You probably figure out a solution, or you think maybe there isn't a solution, so I just need to suck it up. Like, it's not worth wasting any more time on this. Or you might sit down and think maybe this isn't even a real problem. Like, it's not worth thinking about it anymore. Like, but you'd be able to think it through using your brain in a more rounded and balanced way. Like, and you probably wouldn't spend 2 hours just going round and round in circles and making things worse, right? So managing the state of mind that you're in when you choose to, I call this the never mind the quality, feel the width approach to therapy, right? It's not so much the content of your thoughts, it's partly like the amount of time that you're spending thinking about it while you're in the wrong state of mind to do problem solving. So it'd be like, you're washing your windows for hours with dirty water. If you just started doing that when, oh, this isn't working, what I'll do is I'll stop. Like, I'll come back to this later when I've got a bucket of clean water. Like, that's basically what Chrysippus is advising you to do.
I like it. Listen, you said you wanted to do this for an hour, and we're in an hour and 10. So do you get time for one more question, or do you want to begin
Yeah,
to
we'll
wrap
do.
this
Let's
up?
do. Let's do one more question, and then we'll wrap things up. It's always a good idea to leave people wanting more, and there is a lot more here. Like, this is just the tip of the Stoic iceberg, But hopefully, it's kind of planted some seeds, and people can see that if that nothing else, I want people to take away from this that this guy Chrysippus wasn't playing games. Like, he wrote a book on psychotherapy 2,250 years ago, like, which is way more advanced than I won't slag off Freud and Jung and Adler and all the other guys like that. He's Carl Rogers, Fritz Perl, you name them, right? But it's definitely way more sophisticated than a lot of the self improvement influencers that you find on YouTube. Like, I think
Yeah,
it's fair to say.
right. And so this becomes part of the question, right? I mean, it's sort of my wrap up question. We've had good thinking about our bad thinking for 2,200 years. Um, why haven't we solved it? Why is bad thinking still so profitable, so everywhere? It's popular.
The Stoics have an explanation for that, and they call it the double perversion. That's their name for it, right? So their explanation is kind of interesting. I'm still not entirely sure what to make of it, but their explanation is that pleasure and pain are inherently persuasive. So by their very nature, they say more generally there are certain things, but they seem to particularly focus on the sensations of pleasure and pain. So they think there's something baked into human nature that makes us inclined to believe that painful things are bad and pleasurable things are good. Now, obviously, we immediately run into a problem with that, and we think, well, having maybe doing exercise and having surgery are painful or uncomfortable, but they could be good for you. And we can all think of lots of things that are pleasurable but are bad for us, right? But the Stoics think there's this persuasive quality that these sensations and experiences have that kind of dupe us. And they said that's compounded by the effect of society. So bad companionship. So they think other people then are swayed by the persuasive quality of their impressions, the sensory experiences in particular, experience of pleasure and pain in particular, and then they create a culture and language and society like that's based on these perverted values, as the Stoics call it. And so, our own nature is vulnerable to it, and then we're indoctrinated into it by society, Chrysippus says. And the other thing I would say is the old enemy of philosophy, which is political propaganda. Like, and I guess you could add into that like marketing and stuff today. Like, so a lot of people out there have a vested financial interest or some other vested interest in manipulating people's emotions. And that's the same from the time of the Athenian assembly and the law courts, like all the way down to, the current state of American politics, CNN, Fox News, Elon Musk's Twitter algorithms, Facebook algorithms. Like they're designed to exploit your anger, to make you greedy. They're designed. You've got Andrew Tate going on about his Bugattis. What he's doing is trying to stoke your envy and greed, right? Of clearly, and stoke fear. Like there's all these people that aren't like you out there, and they're scary, and they're coming to take your stuff, right? They're going to get you. It could be Scottish people. You've got to watch out for those Scottish people, right? There's too many of them.
I told a friend
Come and
this I
steal
told
your
a friend
job.
this morning. Yeah, right. They're coming after you. But I told a friend this morning. I said I would like to live the life that I see you live on Instagram, and she said to me, "Yeah, I would too." But you're right. It's the algorithm designed to tell us a story that doesn't exist.
So that, I mean, a lot of times what we're doing in therapy is undoing what all the hokey mumbo jumbo that people have absorbed from the internet and politicians and, the fear, the anger. Like it was the same in the ancient. Well, it's no coincidence that wherever you find a sophist, you find Socrates hanging around. Like, Socrates was fascinated by the sophists. They were like his frenemies, right? He thought they were really interesting, but they were kind of also really messing with people's heads, like because their emphasis on rhetoric at all costs and persuasion at all costs, they thought made them more powerful. Like, it made them very wealthy. But Socrates thought, but this is manipulating people and misleading them. Like, and people need to learn to think for themselves if they want to flourish in life. Basically, cognitive therapy is like the modern equivalent of the Socratic method, and the whole of the internet, marketing, politicians, the news media are like the equivalent of the ancient Athenian orators and the sophists. But that's not the only reason. The other reason is we naturally have a blind spot, like Galen said. So that's one reason that we don't always get better, because sometimes we need other people to point out like what our flaws are. Like, I mean, I'll give you an example of that. This is very obvious to me. There's these big self-improvement communities on the internet, like the Manosphere ones, like Andrew Tate, Jordan Peterson, the Liver King, all these kind of dudes. They all do like self-improvement stuff. And a lot of the people that fought, like, so on the one hand, they're often spend a lot of their time getting really angry and like really blaming certain groups of people for all of their problems, which is weirdly strikes me as not something we normally do in therapy. We don't normally sit down with a client in therapy and the client's like, well, I'm finding I'm a bit depressed and angry about stuff. And the therapist says, well, what you need to do is blame all those Johnny foreigners, like, and the feminists and cultural Marxists. They're the ones that are messing you up. Like, so you should get a lot more upset about other people's actions and blame them for all your problems. That's the opposite of what therapy normally looks like. Therapy normally involves taking more ownership and more responsibility for your emotions. So weirdly, we have this kind of cult of self-improvement online that really is the opposite of what it claims to be. Like, what they're actually doing is indoctrinating people into externalizing responsibility, blaming everyone else a lot of the time. So it's quite eerie how similar it is to some of the ancient sophists. The ancient sophists combined self-improvement with political propaganda. To me, these are like oil and water. They're two things that just don't really combine that well together. You can't manipulate people like and exploit their greed, fear, and anger, and at the same time hope to do therapy and self-improvement with them. Like, they're two fundamentally incompatible processes, right? So I look at those people and they're usually obsessed with self-discipline and productivity, and to some extent building self-confidence. All these young guys that are in these self-improvement kicks, right? And it's the same for the ancient sophists. They were like, it's about self-discipline, it's about courage, are the things that they focus on. But as an outsider looking at it, it strikes me that a lot of the times they're really angry. Like, and you think as an outsider, buddy, the reason that you don't have a girlfriend has got nothing to do with tidying your bed. Like, it's got nothing to do like with being more productive at work and stuff like that. Like, it's probably got to do with the fact that you're really angry and entitled, and that you don't do anything about it. Basically, if you're really angry with people, that tends to be one of the most toxic things for relationships in general. So, as an outsider, it's like they've got a glaringly obvious problem that they're not doing anything to address. So, they're off here working on other aspects of their life. And, like Galen said, it's almost like they need somebody else to come up to them and say, like, that your real problem lies elsewhere. If you're going to do self improvement, you're not really doing it at all. If all your self improvement efforts are focused on the wrong problem, that's not your problem. Like, your problem is obvious to everybody else standing around, like looking at you. So that blind spot, a lack of awareness, is one of the reasons we don't benefit. And then there's something else, Phil, that I want to mention briefly. There's a bunch of things, but one of them is the folk psychology, not understanding how emotions work. So, like, that buying into that prevents us from improving. But the other thing is there's some research that shows that rule governed behavior tends to lead to kind of rigid styles of coping. So, what's the abbreviated version of
Okay,
this?
say that one more time. What was that sentence?
Rule governed, like verbal rule governed behavior tends to be inflexible. And so it leads to
All right.
rigid
I'm
styles
just
of
gonna
coping.
translate that into English for the people who don't speak
So,
Scottish, right?
in plain
Rule
English,
governed. Yeah.
rule, right?
Rule rule
So,
governed behavior. I get it, the problem. That make your bed thing we talked about
yeah.
earlier.
So the problem is, if you buy a self-help book and it says, here's 12 rules for life, for example, like what people tend to often do is follow those rules in a rigid way, not adapting them to different circumstances. And so they'll work sometimes and then they'll find themselves in a situation where it's not applicable, it doesn't work, but they'll carry on trying to do it. Right. And so then the coping skill or the advice might be like, okay, but the rigid and flexible way that they're applying it is a more serious problem. So we know from research on stress that people who exhibit what's sometimes called coping flexibility, like, tend to be more emotionally resilient. And so one of the reasons that people don't flourish more is information is handed down from experts in the form of books and stuff like that, and it gets condensed and simplified. And then people take away maxims and sayings and stuff like that, and then they over apply them in a rigid manner. That's why Socrates didn't like books. Like, Socrates was very aware of this problem. He thought the sophists did exactly this. So they would give people slogans like 12 rules or whatever that sounded really cool. And he thought they were kind of profound, but they were rigid and inflexible and overly simplistic. And that's why Socrates said, my goal isn't to teach you some kind of slogan or strategy, but to teach you how to question things, to teach you. I'll give you a very quick example. He said, like, for instance, he's talking to a young guy that had studied with all the sophists. And for him, flourishing was about understanding justice. And he thought that he was very just, and that would make him a great politician. And Socrates says, well, what is, define justice? And he said, well, it's easier to define injustice. And he said, well, I define injustice as stealing and lying and stuff like that. Because that's the definition, the verbal definition that he'd been taught. Right. So he, like a parrot, he'd like memorize it, he repeats it. And Socrates is like, wow, like injustice is like lying and stealing. Like, you've got this huge library of books and you paid a fortune to all these sophists and you've got this like profound insight, right? Socrates said, what about if you're an elected military general, the Athenians elected their generals, like, and you lie to the enemy during a war? Is that unjust? And he's like, well, that's different. Like, that's not the same, Socrates. He said, another classic example, he said, what if you have a small child and you have to give them bitter medicine for an illness, and the only way they'll take it is if you conceal it in their food? Isn't that deception? Is that unjust? And he's like, well, that's different, Socrates. That's a different situation. He says, what if your friend's suicidal and they ask you where you hid their sword or where you hid their dagger? That's a famous example in philosophy. Like, and the young guy, Euthydemus, is like, okay, I kind of see what you're getting at here. Like, maybe my definition was too rigid, too simplistic. And even if they don't arrive at a better definition, a better verbal rule, like Socrates thinks the process of questioning it and noticing the exceptions has deepened your understanding. You've got a clearer perception of the territory of what justice means and how to navigate the concept. So people thought they didn't have like, this is what the paradox of Socrates. People feel like um, they still think, but at the end of this, surely there's a verbal definition like that you need to give me. There's a better verbal definition or something like that. And I think Socrates' point is that understanding doesn't necessarily consist in having a concise verbal definition. It can help in some ways, but real understanding comes from being able to use the concept and to engage with discussion around it and understand the fuzzy edges and the exceptions to it and so on. Like, and we too readily accept simplistic, rigid definitions. Now, that would apply to coping strategies like mindfulness, tidy your room, like you name it. Like any good advice you give people, they can apply badly, basically. But the guy that flourishes is the guy that you teach a technique to, and he comes back next week and he says, I took that technique that you taught me, like, and I modified it a little bit and I combined it with some other things. And I figured out that I had to adapt it to different situations. That guy's got the holy grail of coping flexibility.
This is awesome. And of course, lots of people have told us that already inside the chat. What do you want people to do? They want to know more. Clearly, there's 250 people on here now while we're live who want to know about Stoic psychotherapy. Where do they go if they want to know more?
Well, if they go to my Substack, that's easy. We're on Substack, and you can just go and look at my Substack, and I've got hundreds and hundreds of articles and podcasts and things like that there. So go and check that out. I'm working on a book at the moment that's about anger and Stoic psychotherapy. So kind of drawing on Seneca, but combining it with modern affective neuroscience and evidence-based psychotherapy, like kind of like seeing how this could merge together. And I'm hoping to put together an article that's kind of like an overview of some of the things that I've been trying for ages to just write an article about the Chrysippus's Therapeuticon, but it kind of ends up getting a bit too long and too involved. So I'm going to have a go at putting together a kind of simple overview, just summarizing some of the basic things that we talked about today. And then they can find that, maybe that'll come out in a week or two on my Substack. And they should follow modern Stoicism as well.
Yeah, I mean, why would you not want to follow modern Stoicism and all of us, Phil Yanov and Donald Robertson, do all of that? I think those are all very positive things. Let me just say a thing that you've been too modest to mention so far, which I think is pretty fantastic, right? So the first one of these, was the slowing the things down, and the second one was premeditation of adversity kind of thing, and the third one was Socratic questioning, right? Being able to engage in some of that. And you've got a great book on this. I know lots of people love how to think like Socrates. I mean, I came to you through the first one, or through your first How to Think book, but this How to Think Like Socrates is something that will give people a moment to pause and think about how they can employ some of these ideas in their life. And it's written in this same tone. I say this now to the folks who are here with us live. If you like the way Donald talks, you're going to love the way he writes. And it's given that same sort of very personal voice he brings to Socrates, which, by the way, if you read Xenophon, it could be a hard read. But Donald makes this easy to listen to.
Yeah, check out that book. It's not a self-help book, but it isn't.
Yeah.
If you ask me, is it a self-help book? I'd say yes and no.
Yeah.
It's different.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that?
I think it's more like what self-help should be like, but it's like encouraging people to question things and think about things and practice cognitive flexibility, practice the Socratic method. But, that's not necessarily going to give you clean-cut, prefabricated answers like the sophists, like slogans and so on. Might leave you with more questions, I say in the book at the end of it, you might conclude that having read that entire book, you now know less than you did before you began reading it. And so some people might not like that.
Yeah.
It might not be everyone's cup of tea, but some people thought that was more valuable.
Some guy said to me a couple weeks ago, I was standing somewhere in public, and the guy said, "Did you say that you knew X or Y?" I forget what it was he was actually challenging me about, and I thought, I don't really want to get involved in a conversation. So I said to him, I said, "The only thing I said is that I know nothing." And it just completely threw him for a loop that I wasn't going to make a claim in that moment, other than I'm not sure I know any of this stuff. I mean, I'm willing to think it through with you, but I don't know if I know.
Don't you think it's weird how on the internet, I think it's a sort of vice of podcasters that they have to act as if they're experts on lots of different subjects. It's the opposite of Socratic intellectual humility. Like, I'm going to pick on the same guy yet again because I just think obviously Jordan Peterson fell into that trap. Like, he was suddenly an expert on climate change and like geopolitical issues, and he never mentions CBT. Like, because he was a professor in clinical psychology, but he talks about everything else under the sun, like the economy and stuff like that. And you think, I'm not really sure that you actually are an expert on all of these different subjects, but you seem to be assuming the mantle of one, right? But I think it's something about if you're going to make a lot of money from being an influencer and being on the internet, like it's quite tempting because people go, can you talk about the economy? Can you talk about climate change? Can you talk about epidemiology? Did you notice how many people suddenly became experts on epidemiology a few years ago? I thought that was that was remarkable.
Absolutely.
Um, I mean, weirdly, Socrates uses very similar examples. Like he talks to people who claim to be able to give the assembly advice on medicine, and he's like, "But you're not a physician," Like he's some of the dialogues. That's exactly the kind of thing that he's questioning. He says it's really dangerous, like to society, if politicians start to behave as if they're experts on medicine. He calls this double ignorance. They don't know that they're ignorant. They don't know how little they know. Well, it's similar to what we would call the Dunning-Kruger effect today, right? But he's like, but they're talking to large numbers of people and making, influencing society, and they don't know how little they know about the things that they're claiming to be experts on. RFK Jr., I think, would be like a really good example of that. That's a guy who clearly doesn't understand anything about medical research, like even the most basic research method terminology or concepts. But he goes on Joe Rogan and stuff like that and pulls out research studies and misinterprets them left, right, and center. Like he's a guy that any expert in medicine or health research would immediately know has no idea what he's talking about. And yet he's whatever he is in the American administration. So there are some people I think it's beyond dispute. Like they're clearly assuming a mantle of authority in a subject that they have no training, credentials, or experience in. But that's
Yeah,
the internet and politics, and the internet will do that to you. Phil, you have to watch out.
you fall in love with attention, and then you'll say anything in order to make that happen, right? I mean, it just is that kind of thing, and so I think that's kind of what goes on there. All right, my friend, I would love to continue talking to you. Maybe some folks would even want to listen to that. I think maybe we should do that another day. But today, um, you know, go join Donald's Substack, please, if you're interested in what we're doing with modern Stoicism and or interested in some of the articles and things that we're putting out. That's a good way to do that is follow the Substack of modern Stoicism. And, my goal here is to host great thinkers in fascinating conversations. And that's what we do with our conversations series. Normally we're doing those things on Zoom, so you get to talk to other folks as well. But in this case, we wanted to bring this out and see how this works. So this is an experiment. Thank you for playing the game with us. And most certainly, I hope you would agree, nothing terrible has befallen you.
Yeah, this works. Substack works.
I'm the guy that worries about it, and it works.
Sounds like it works. What do you know? That's pretty cool. All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Thanks once again to Phil for your giving us your time and technical assistance, and I look forward to speaking to some of you online or maybe in person in future.
Yeah. I look forward to seeing y'all. Thank you, friends.
Okay, cheers. Bye, everyone.